Hello, everybody, and welcome to our virtual book talk this evening featuring Janneke Adema, who in a few moments will be offering us a preview of her new book, Living Books, Experiments in Posthumanities. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, founding editor of the online journal Tech Shop Experiments and its new book publishing arm, Tech Shop Editions. Also with me today is Felix Borgos, who's been with me from the very beginning and co-founded the journal back in 2015. Before we get to tonight's program, just a quick intro to Tech Shop Experiments and what we've been up to the last few months. Tech Shop Experiments is an open access and peer-reviewed journal founded in 2015 with Felix Borgos at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. It is the first journal dedicated to the apparatus known as electracy and to the work of media theorist Gregory L. Ulmer. Since our founding, we've expanded our mission and have welcomed original scholarship, creative criticism, and artworks in the digital humanities, reading and writing, rhetoric, culture, internet studies, and more. Earlier this year, I founded Tech Shop Editions, and we've published our first two titles. The first is Defense Mechanism by Krzysztof Szewczyk, and translated by Piotr Florczyk, and Sonnet 100 by Marilyn Allen. Our third title, Library of by Dan Beachy-Quick, will be out in the coming months, and we are currently making decisions on our 2022 lineup, and hope to have 4 new titles released next year and news announced shortly. Links to all of these will be made available in the chat. If you are interested in learning more or in submitting a manuscript or article to the journal or to the book publishing arm, you can please reach out via email. Before introducing tonight's guest, I would like to ask all of those in attendance to turn your microphones off during the talk. Following Janneke's talk, there will be time to accept questions from those in attendance and those via message for those who are watching via Facebook. I should make a note that this is being recorded and it will be made available in the coming weeks on the Tech Shop Experiments YouTube channel. Thank you. All right, now on to the main event. Tonight's guest is Dr. Janneke Adema. She is a cultural and media theorist working in the fields of book publishing and digital culture. Janneke is an assistant professor of digital media at the Center for Post-Digital Cultures at Coventry University in the UK. In her research, she explores the future of scholarly communications and experimental forms of knowledge production, where her work incorporates the performative of publishing, radical open access, post-publishing, media studies, book history, cultural studies, and critical theory. She explores these issues in depth in various publications, but also by supporting a variety of scholar-led, not-for-profit publishing projects, including Radical Open Access Collective, Open Humanities Press, Scholar-led, and the Post Office Press, POP, and the Research England and Arcadia Fund community-led open access publication infrastructures for monographs, or COPIM project, which is on which she's a co-PI. She has recently published her monograph, Living Books, Experiments in the Posthumanities, which is available open access at MIT Press, also available via print. Please check that out. And you can follow her research on openreflections.wordpress.com. And again, all of these will be in the link in the chat shortly. With that, I would like to welcome Janneke.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And yeah, thank you so much, Kevin and Felix also for inviting me to give this talk. So I'm really delighted that it actually falls under the Tech Shops Experiments banner, because it, as a kind of an open access journal that supports experimental work, that's exactly the kind of projects that I describe and yes, support also as part of Living Books. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen now with you guys. Just bear with me when I do that. I think that's full screen already, right? All right. So I have structured this talk around 3 concepts or keywords that play an important role throughout Living Books, and which I will use as a way to introduce some of the arguments that I make in the book. So these keywords are radical open access, experimentation, and versioning. And I'm mostly going to focus on the first 2. So after discussion of the first 2 concepts and their importance to the arguments made in Living Books, I want to shortly say something about how Living Books came about and the methodology of versioning that informs and underlies the book. So Living Books for a large part derives from my involvement in the open access movement, especially also from my interest in open access as a potential radical critique of the systems of material knowledge production that are dominant in humanities book publishing today, and the neoliberal discourses and practices underlying this that have turned the book into an object and a commodity. However, as I argue in Living Books, openness is not one thing and has always been theorized and practiced in different ways. So openness functions therefore as a floating signifier, as a concept without a fixed meaning that is easily adopted by different political ideologies. So it is this very openness and lack of fixity of the concept that gives it its power, but it also brings with it a risk of uncertainty about its future adoption. So in Living Books, I, to some extent, try to reclaim openness from critics of open access that relate it or its roots to neoliberalism, or see its current uptake as part of profit-focused author-pays models as exemplary. Instead, I explore how the understanding of open access, openness, and open science has been heavily contested, and how separate discourses on the concept of openness have been developed within the scholarly communication realm. So openness, as Leslie Chan has argued, is not a binary condition, but is highly situational, contingent, and dependent on context. And different groups theorize openness according to different underlying value systems. So this emphasis that I place on the variety that makes up the schools of thought on openness and open access therefore serves to counter the vision that open access is intrinsically connected to neoliberalist discourses and practices. And it enables me to argue instead that it can, at least potentially, be used as a powerful critique of these systems. For example, practices and theories of radical open access are critical of openness in its neoliberal guises, but still try to engage with the open in an affirmative way too. Now, what I and others are calling radical open access is, however, not one thing, nor is it an overarching plan. So it consists of various groups, peoples, institutions, and projects with their own affordances. Moreover, radical open access is also a contingent and contextual approach that cannot easily be pinned down, as it's an ongoing critical project. So one that endeavors to embrace its own inconsistencies and struggles with its own conceptions of openness. So radical open access experiments, albeit neither homogeneous nor predefined, tend to focus on both access and reuse, on a critique of the overly commercial political economy surrounding publishing, and on establishing both a practical and an experimental publishing practice. So radical open access can thus be seen as theories or practices of open access that are focused on openness as a means to critique established systems, rethink the book and the humanist understandings that accompany it, change scholarly practices by focusing on doing scholarship differently, exploring experimentation, and finally, and perhaps most importantly in this context, critique the concept and practices of openness, as well as the dichotomies between closed and open, and between the book and the net that keep being reintroduced. So radical open access in this broader conceptualization draws inspiration from a wide-ranging set of practices and histories, from the groundbreaking community-led initiatives set up in Latin America to the early experiments with open access journals in the humanities and social sciences, and a continuous tradition of grassroots activist work within academia and publishing. So within Living Books, I explore radical open access as a relational practice and as part of an ethics of care. And I detail various projects or radical open access initiatives that have tried to experiment with open access as a means of developing progressive, counter-institutional alternatives. So for example, these include Open Humanities Press, which as an international collective involves multiple self-governing scholarly communities. Operating as a radical heterogeneous collective. So Open Humanities Press has focused on countering negative perceptions that still exist concerning open access and online publishing by creating a trustworthy, reliable, high-quality system for those scholars skeptical about online modes of distribution and dissemination. So battling these negative perceptions serves two goals, Open Humanities Press argues. First, it makes experimentation with new business models possible and can therefore work to help solve the ongoing publishing crisis in the arts and humanities. And second, it paves the way for further experiments in scholarly communication with new forms of writing and publishing and with open content and open editing, for instance, something that stands at the basis of Open Humanities Press projects. I also discussed Kathleen Fitzpatrick's experiments with open or peer-to-peer review for her book Planned Obsolescence, which very much focused on re-envisioning peer review and quality control in a digital context, pushing it toward a more community-oriented system. Furthermore, her experiments, continued with her later book, Generous Thinking, aim to change the way we think about academic publishing and peer review, moving away from, as she says, a system focused on the production and dissemination of individual products to imagining it as a system focused more broadly on facilitating the process of scholarly work, or the processes of scholarly work. There's also Ted Striffa's Differences and Repetitions Wiki, which is a site for open source writing along the lines of Libre Read Write Open Access, which contains fully editable wiki projects and working papers and functions as a personal, though at the same time collaborative archive of writing. So Striffa similarly argues that we need to engage with peer review as a specific fixture of scholarly communication more creatively in order to explore its future. So his wiki, which functioned as a form of free publication review, is a good example of that, as well as comprising an investigation into more communal forms of writing, questioning the individual author and his or her propriety. So in addition to these kind of three projects, I also discuss initiatives such as Mattering Press in this context, who, as part of their theoretical and practical interventions, are exploring alternative forms of relational publishing. So this includes envisioning their publishing outlook and relationship with the research community within and as part of an ethics of care. So as Mattering Press emphasizes, this ethics of care mark vital relations and practices whose value cannot be calculated and thus often goes unacknowledged where logics of calculation are dominant. So for Mattering Press, then, care can help offset and engage with the calculative logic and metrics-based regimes that permeate academic publishing infrastructures and increasingly determine how we relate to one another. So these experiments in radical open access publishing aim to stimulate access and reuse of scholarly content by critiquing the economics and excessive commercialization of the current scholarly publishing system and by setting up their own alternative publishing institutions. But for these initiatives, open access also forms a starting point for further interrogation of our humanist institutions, practices, notions of academic authorship, the book, content creation, copyright, and publication, among other things. As I therefore argue within Living Books, experimenting with these aspects and with the form of the book plays a crucial role in forms of radical open access publishing. So within Living Books, I present experimentation as an alternative to the discourse of innovation that structures more neoliberal forms of knowledge production. So here, researchers are increasingly asked to experiment with new ideas, methods, or practices, not just for experiment's sake or to encourage critical thought, but in the name of innovation, leading to results that are deemed to be an improvement over the previous situation, in the sense that they serve dynamic economic growth. So here, a focus on innovation driving economic growth creates situations in which our ideas of experimentation, or even of critique as open intellectual inquiry, are challenged by what is in essence a corporate model, including rhetoric of planned outcomes, risk analysis, and contingency plans, all of which are designed to filter out the uncertain and the unpredictable. So if we adhere to a neoliberal logic, then we need continual innovation to stimulate the competitive mechanisms that encourage this dynamic growth. So Henry Giroux argues that in this context, critical thought has given way to market-driven values of corporate interest. Knowledge becomes a product, a commodity, just another form of capital. So to develop a critique of this notion of perpetual innovation that is increasingly structuring our knowledge domains, I therefore differentiate this business rhetoric of innovation that accompanies the University of Excellence and more neoliberal visions of openness from the alternative vision of experimentation as promoted from within cultural studies, among other fields. So here experimentation is rather understood as a heterogeneous, unpredictable, singular, and uncontained process or experience. So a more inclusive vision of experimentation is put forward here, one that is open for ambivalence and for failure. So this vision is all the more important in the context of monograph publishing, where I contend in living books that issues of access and experimentation are crucial to the future of the scholarly book, if the critical potentiality of the book as a medium is to remain open to new political, economic, and intellectual contingencies. So cultural studies as a field has always been interested in exploring more inclusive forms of knowledge that acknowledge otherness and difference and that are more effective and experiential. So this exploration by cultural theorists of different forms of knowledge was initiated, among other means, by restoring the separation between the concept of experience and experiment. So Raymond Williams, under the heading of empiricism in his Keywords volume, explores the etymology of experiment and how it came to mean something different from experience, with which until the 18th century it was interchangeable. So where experience started to mean subjective or internal knowledge, experiment came to be aligned with the scientific method of an arranged methodological observation of an event, a theoretical knowledge directed toward the external world. For Williams, however, experience is crucial to tackle and grasp change, flux, flow, all that escapes our fixed efforts at signification and at knowing. So the splitting of experience and experiment then led to distinctions between practical and theoretical, between subjective and objective knowledge, and between experience past and present. So Williams wanted wholeness again with respect to this concept, with experience now based upon a set of exclusions, so of theory, of creativity, of the present and future, and upon a subjectively centered model of consciousness. So Williams aimed to explore experimentation as a way of opening up space for difference and otherness beyond their hegemonic conceptual knowledge frameworks, can be extended to our knowledge institutions and practices more widely too, including to the university and to the book. So experimentation can thus be seen as a critical process that allows for the emergence of multiplicities, opening up spaces for difference and otherness beyond our fixating and totalizing conceptual and knowledge frameworks. So in Living Books, I explore how experimentation in scholarly publishing can work out in practice by looking at how it can work out in practice by looking at a variety of publishing initiatives within the field of cultural studies, including Thera McPherson's multimodal journal Vectors and the C-Search archive, which is now defunct. So McPherson frames some of the publishing projects that she has been involved in, such as Vectors, which is an openly available multimedia journal and platform that investigates the intersections of technology and culture, and Scalar, which is a multimedia scholarly publishing and author platform, So she frames these specifically within a framework of experimentation. So the aim of both these projects is to use experimentation to explore new publishing practices that try to make better use of the potentialities and affordances that the internet has to offer, from multimodal scholarship to networked forms of communication. As Macpherson puts it, in this respect, Vectors has functioned largely as an experimental space, publishing work that is formally challenging and that explores the boundaries of what might count as scholarly argument. So for these specific projects, this has meant examining the boundaries between creative expression and scholarship, exploring so-called emergent genres that better take advantages of the affordances of computation. This includes investigating bold new forms of experimentation and bookishness to push scholarly publishing in the humanities further. Now, Ted Strifers has noted that experiments in cultural studies publishing, including experiments in open access publishing, have mainly taken place at the fringes of the field, where these kinds of explorations have mostly been ignored and undervalued as a subject of exploration. Now, this can partly be explained by the way in which our socially constructed habits and honored ways of doing things lead us to engage with repetitive practices in the way that we read, write, do research, publish, and assess our research finding. So experimentation, as described earlier, also serves to question the fixtures in scholarly book publishing that we have grown accustomed to, especially those established as part of our modern system of scholarly communication and the mostly print-based media ecologies of the 20th century. So we therefore need to think more creatively and expansively, Strifers argues, about these fixtures in scholarly communication and how they might work otherwise. So for example, peer review and authorship. So as stated previously, Strifers uses his Differences and Repetitions wiki to explore this, to experiment with new digital and collaborative writing practices that challenge the accustomed tradition of single authorship and the idea of ownership of works and ideas, trying to not give in to the compulsion to repeat and merely produce more of the same. So for Strifers, the Open Wiki experiment is not meant to function as a new type of institution, but as a thing to think with, ongoing, changing, uncertain. So a similar sense of open experimentation stood at the base of one of the earliest online cultural studies archive, the C-Search e-archive and publishing project, which was founded in 2006. So based on the model of the physics preprint archive, archive.org, C-Search was a free open access archive for cultural studies research literature and related materials, and was provided as a further supplement to the online open access journal Culture Machine. So Gary Hall, one of the founders of C-Search, argues that setting up C-Search was motivated by a need to creatively experiment with the invention of new institutional forms, to think the university different, and to help us conceive a different future for it. So the archive formed an experiment with making digital open text available online and was one of the first projects to explore some of the possibilities that these online works have beyond merely replicating print in the online world. So here it was felt that with their lack of fixity and permanence, with their undermining of traditional intermediaries and roles, such as publishers and libraries, and their use of an incorporation of different media, so these works have the potential to fundamentally transform the content that they transmit, and with that, to change our relationship to knowledge, emphasizing the performativity and material agency of our research. Now, for the third part of this book, of this talk, I want to go over to the publishing process itself and how that is actually part or became part of the argument that I make within Living Books. So as a research and publishing project, Living Books always wanted to carve out a small intervention into how books are produced, disseminated, and published by publishing the book and the research that has informed it in an open, experimental, and processual way. So the pop-up iteration of Living Books specifically allows different releases or versioning, in other words, the updating, rewriting, or modifying of published academic material. So versioning has been an underlying method during the development of living books over the last 10 years, where I published versions of my research in development on different platforms. So from blogging and annotation platforms to wikis, preferring, as I highlight in the book, those that favor experimentation, openness, interaction, multimodality, and interdisciplinarity. Versioning can also question individual humanist authorship, where I used it to highlight the inherent collaborative nature of living books. For example, several earlier versions were co-authored or remixed, commented upon and annotated, and further shaped by the platforms that they were published on, where newer versions again incorporated or reworked this feedback. Oh, sorry, this wasn't there yet. So the start of this book lies back in 2008, when I finished my MA and started writing a research blog called Open Reflections, which was a way for me to publish my research ideas as they were developing, to report back from conferences and events, and establish connections with other research projects and researchers. So blogs were both still relatively novel in academia then, while also being heavily experimented with in digital humanities and media studies circles. So in this sense, the blog provided me the opportunity to experiment with publishing my research in development in an alternative, more direct way. So more direct than traditional print-based scholarly outputs. So for example, by incorporating a different writing style, a different length and format, by incorporating pictures, video, etc. And the blog's commenting functions, and this was still in the heydays of RSS, offer the option for more direct interactions around the research too. So this experiment with blogging very much formed the basis for my interest in other more experimental forms of open publishing and to explore alternative futures for the book in general. So experimenting with and reimagining the book as living, collaborative, and iterative is an essential part of my intervention to challenge the ongoing objectification and commodification and to highlight the inherent dynamic materiality of the book. So when an opportunity arose to do a PhD on the future of the monograph at Coventry University with Gary Hall, himself experimenting with the future of the book and open access through Open Humanities Press, amongst others, I decided to use my blog as a way to openly develop my thesis while also rethinking the form and practice of the thesis. So the various versions or iterations of my thesis, and later of living books, extended from blog posts to papers, articles, and conference presentations to being, for example, intersliced with Mark America's research as part of his Remixed book project. So my research then developed into a differential thesis, which was eventually published in the form of a standard PDF, which was what had to be submitted as part of the thesis fulfillment requirements, and in a wiki and a common press version. So you can see in the slide here, that's the blog, the common press version, and the wiki there. And they're all still up, I hope. So after that, Living Books further evolved into a book published by the MIT Press. Originally, I envisioned it to be a much more interactive and maybe much more experimental work, but it turned out very difficult to find a press to publish that. So I tuned down the kind of expectations that I had initially. But I still had to negotiate quite a lot, even around getting it available openly, publishing it openly. That did happen, and the press helped me find funding. And after I found out that it could be published in open access, an opportunity arose to also have it published simultaneously on the Pop-Up platform, which is a platform that's run by the Knowledge Futures Group, meaning that this iteration of Living Books is also again available in different versions. So as you can see here, so on the left-hand side, that's the Pop-Up version. It's also available, as Kevin already said, in print, so you can see that there. And it's also available as an open access PDF on the MIT Press Direct platform. And interesting enough, there were some issues with the copyright license there, which was first full copyright, but the press has now changed that. So it should be now the same license everywhere, CC by NC. That version on the MIT Press Direct platform has different PDFs for each chapter. If you want to have a PDF of the whole book, you can go to my website. So the latest, so the pop-up version, and I think that's what's quite interesting because it kind of leaves that versioning that's been part of the project open, can be updated, can be remixed, and can be commented upon. So this latest pop-up version of Living Books in many ways returns to its earlier iterations as a series of blog posts open for comments and further development, also in a time when there was much more interaction still around blogs. So each subsequent version of this processual book served different goals and functions along the way. So from sharing and communicating research to career progress and promotion, from further refining texts and arguments with the help of colleagues and collaborators, to connecting them to and interweaving them with new ideas and works, or simply to explore what medial forms would fit the research best during its various stages. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. So many thanks for listening, and do let me know if you have any questions. And I'm happy to say more about this process of publishing too, and of course about the arguments that I make in the book. So thank you very much.
There we go. All right. Thank you so much, Janneke. We've got some hands going, so virtual claps to you. Hooray.
Thank you.
We are taking questions from the audience. We do have plenty of time for, I think, a very good discussion here. We're taking them via chat if you'd like to remain anonymous. If you'd like to talk to Janneke and turn on your video, you can raise your hand and I'll call upon you and we'll go about it that way. If you are watching on Facebook, type in your questions via the message board and Felix will make sure that they're entered into the chat for me to read on your behalf. So thank you. While we're waiting for questions here and hands to be raised, Janneke, I'm very interested in how you kind of originally saw this project developing. What kind of multimodal thing did you originally envision, and what was that negotiation process like as you were looking for publishers?
Yeah, so that was quite a difficult one. I think I was in a way a little bit naive. I mean, this is my first book, so I didn't have that kind of experience yet also with negotiating with publishers around that. And I think it was also, there's been quite a change since that time, because I think I started looking for a publisher around 2015. And around this time, I think there's so many more opportunities to do more experimental work. I was also partly constrained because we've got kind of assessment frameworks, of course, in the UK that I need to abide to. So that there was kind of a push for it to be published with a university press, for example, right? I think you've got similar US kind of requirements there. And at that time, there weren't that many university presses doing experimental work. So I remember my initial plan, because I was kind of, when I started a thesis too, I wanted to do, it was more focused on remix, I think. And then Mark America's book came out, Remix the Book, and it kind of did a little bit already what I envisioned to do with the thesis. But I wanted to expand that. And my initial idea was that I would write a book and I would then invite, and I already had an idea who that would be. So there was kind of a plan after that. And the idea would be then to invite people to create their own books out of that and write a kind of a response book. It doesn't have to be a full book, but some kind of, and that those would then also be separately published. So quite conceptual, quite out there. And of course, if you're a publisher, you're probably, that sounds a little bit too much. So yeah, I didn't get very far with that. So that was the first pitch I had. I had kind of a standard pitch for a book, but that was the kind of, maybe we could do that, but that didn't really work. So eventually I just tuned it down, and I went with a standard book proposal. And advice I got from colleagues and friends was just try that first, get your foot in, and then do the open access and experimental argument there. I'm not quite sure that was the best way, because I've heard a lot of experiences from people in the meantime that say, like, no, it's much better to be upfront and just try and be clear with what you want to do. And to be honest, I didn't have the clearest idea of what I wanted to do experimentation wise. So that might have been part of it too. It was a hard discussion, first of all, around because the Leonardo series normally doesn't do more experimental work, and the MIT Press is quite well known for doing more experimental work, but it's part of one-offs or different series. Open access was also initially an issue because the press was transitioning to a new model, and at that point they were working with subventions. I didn't have any money because, of course, this was from a thesis, not connected to a project. As the press transitioned, and they're now working, looking at a library consortial model to fund. And I think from next year onwards, they're hoping to have all their books open access available. In that momentum, I was able to kind of, make my book, publish my book openly too, with support from the press. So that was really great. And the Knowledge Futures pop-up thing kind of popped up quite shortly after that as an option when I was asked to write an essay about versioning, actually. And it was suggested to me, you might want to also put your book on pop-up, and which was a lovely experience. It was really nice working with the people from the Knowledge Futures group. And I think that's also one of the things that I've really enjoyed throughout this project. It's this trying out of new platforms, of new software, and not only the technological aspects of that, but doing that together with communities of people that are involved in creating those, or that are maintaining them or supporting them, or that are also trying them out, right? From blogging to pop-up and the whole range in between of forms and platforms that we have in between. So I hope that explains it a little bit more in detail, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. And while we're kind of talking about process and development of the project, I would imagine one of the difficulties that you're running into back in 2012, 2013, 2014, as this project kind of taking off and developing and going in different directions, is that the world is very quickly changing as well. And there's lots of new publishers that are coming and going. University presses are changing business models in some cases. In other cases, they're closing. Over the course of when you actually kind of began the research of this project and started the blog to publication, what were some of the major changes in the kind of overall publishing trends and publishing atmosphere and the dialogues around open access? And what were some of the things that have kind of remained the same? I know in the introduction, you actually talk a little bit about the crisis of the monograph. I know it's not necessarily the focus of the book, but the dialogue around that, in some cases, hasn't changed all that much. So in which ways have things like dramatically changed over the last 5 or 8 or 10 years? And in which ways have we not made much progress at all?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's the way that digital develops in general, right? A little bit. It's that kind of up and down, and a lot remains the same at the same time. I mean, one of the key differences with the earlier period is, of course, that especially for books, there is so much more opportunity now to publish your books in open access. There's so much more models, there's so much more presses experimenting with it. There's so much more support also from funders, universities, libraries, etc. I think the pandemic has really again showed us how important it is to have digital open access, right, to materials, also to humanities research when libraries were closed, etc. So there is real growth and development there, and I would say there's also real growth and development in more experimental forms, right? So I know that the Mellon Foundation in the US has given a lot of grants for kind of developing more experimental forms of book publishing, which has been fantastic, right? And I think they've been really great innovators in that sense. So in that sense, I'm really positive indeed about how things have developed. on the other side, the whole kind of commercial neoliberal model that I try to critique in my book, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I am positive about that too, because the projects that I engage with throughout the book, lots of them are still around. Lots of them were startups when I wrote about them and are now well established. Some of them are no longer around. And this is an interesting thing always when you write something over a longer time span, and which is so much involved with, current developments. So it's always going to be outdated to some extent, but I think it still works. But so I think although there has been a kind of more opportunities also of presses that try out alternatives, right? Like your own text of editions and text of experiments, and to showcase that, for example, scholars can also publish books themselves, right? That a lot of the intermediaries are maybe not necessarily anymore. I think there is still a lot of concern about how open access has been adapted as a business model by commercial presses, how APCs and BPCs, so book processing charges and article processing charges, are increasingly introduced, which is not helping with this crisis of scholarly publishing that you just mentioned. Because, for example, as I explained with my own book, there was no way I could find a funding to pay via to get my book in open access via BPC. Similar with scholars from the global south or from institutions that are well less funded, and it also it doesn't work well together with a lot of the kind of more radical diamond open models that have been developed elsewhere. I argue for, together with others, that those are the ones that actually should get support, those kind of bottom-up initiatives, and there should be funding available for them. So I think a lot has changed and nothing has changed at the same time. But I think what this makes clear is that we need to keep up that resistance to show that alternative open models do exist and are being created. And at the same time, I think what I wanted to do with this book, and I think what the projects that I'm involved with also want to do, is to just showcase what is already out there, that there are alternatives that we as scholars can explore to do research and publishing differently. And I hope that is something that people will take up, right? That not only by publishing differently, but maybe also by seeing publishing as something that's an essential aspect of research, which is something that I really try to argue for to the book.
Thank you. We do have an anonymous question coming in. I'd like to read that as it is. It is, why are we buying expensive computers, internet access, and all of these like strange items produced from child labor factories, and yet told that we must give away our own labor?
I'm guessing that kind of refers to how a lot of the projects that I describe in the book are around volunteer labor.
Correct. Yeah, I think the idea, the general question is that we're all kind of tasked with doing so much already, and increasingly, if you're a faculty member, you're teaching more, you're on more committees. If you've left the academy, like some of us have, you're finding a very similar situation. There's more committee work, there's more administrative responsibilities, and yet, here some of us are creating these DIY projects or maintaining them, and doing the best we can, with the hours and time and finances. Because while again, part of the argument here, we have to remind folks, while we're talking about open access isn't free. It does cost these things, and it's not just money, but as this viewer is talking about, it's also a lot of labor. So what's the incentive to continue the good work, I guess?
No, definitely. I mean, I always answer this question in a twofold way. I think one of them is that we already do a lot of free and voluntary labor as part when we do peer review, when we do when we're part of editorial boards, etc. But now we tend to do that for commercial presses. So my argument is stop doing that for those presses and stop doing that for ourselves or for the presses that are not for profits and that kind of support the kind of values and the kind of publishing system that we want to do. So it's a kind of realigning of labor away from those entities that make a profit of it, right? Instead of kind of giving it back to the community. The other aspect is that I am a really big proponent of universities also giving us more time to do this kind of work. And I know that this is something that needs to be negotiated, but people are sometimes able to negotiate time off for editorial work, etc. And I think it's up to us also as researchers to kind of make this clear to our administrators that publishing isn't something that we conveniently outsource, right? Because that's what universities have been doing in so many ways, but that is something that we should try and get on in board or in-house again. And you can see this in the UK. Actually, there's been a really big rise of the establishment of university presses or library presses over the last few years, that universities are starting to see like, hey, actually, it's much cheaper for us now that we're running towards a different economic models to actually start doing this ourselves instead of outsourcing this to these commercial presses and paying them in these new models, APCs and BPCs, etc. So that's two parts of it, I think. I think the further incentive is that I think increasingly, as we want to do more, what I would say, interesting work, more experimental work, we start to see, and also when we start to use more digital tools and methods to communicate, we start to see that actually the process of doing research and publishing start to blur. So I'm giving this talk now, it's being recorded, it's being published, right? This is a form of publishing. This is a form, and having this kind of really fixed print-based idea so that something is only published when it becomes this print book published by MIT Press is, I think, an outdated idea. And we need to kind of think through more at which point we make our research public. And the formal publishing is only one aspect of that. So we are already busy publishing, communicating, curating, selecting work throughout its existence, right? It's becoming more aware of the choices that we make in that, and that it is already part of our research and not something that just comes at the end. And yes, this might mean a little bit more work in the end, but we're already doing that. We're already kind of engaging with research and with others in communication with them in that way. So for me, it's important to kind of start questioning these strict boundaries, I think, a bit more.
Great, thank you. We do have time for another question or two. So if anybody would like to raise your hand and make yourself known, fantastic. We do have another question while we're waiting. Janneke, do you fear the appropriation of experimental or grassroots publishing by commercial entities in the future? And then this person was thinking specifically about things like ResearchGate or academia.edu.
No, definitely. And I think there's been, a lot of kind of examples of things being bought out, right? I think B-Press, I think in the US is an example, and things like a Knowledge on Ledge, which was originally a not-for-profit. I think this is problematic, as is the fact that, I mean, there's a lot of discussions around licensing in this sense too, around whether CC BY is always the best license, or whether in some circumstances CC BY non-commercial would work better, right? I'm not convinced on either yet, so I'm a bit in between. But there have also been examples, of course, of whole collections of open access collections being taken up and sold on Amazon, for example. And although I find this conceptually very interesting, like, oh, you know, this is an interesting example of reuse and remix. This doesn't necessarily play well, of course, with authors if these kind of examples. So yeah, I find that concerning. I think what we need to try and create is kind of institutes, initiatives that are truly community owned. And I think the correct term is inalienable, so that we kind of put in the governance systems specific wording that says that this cannot be sold as a for-profit entities, that it stays part of the community, it stays part of the knowledge commons. So and that's the projects that I'm involved in are very conscious of that and are trying to kind of create mechanisms to ensure that this kind of sell out doesn't happen. But I do fear it, definitely. Yeah.
Great. We do have another question here. This is actually coming from Victor Taylor, who's making himself available on video here, so you can see him.
Thank you for allowing me to ask the question live. Janneke, I really appreciated your presentation. That was excellent, and it brought me back to some of the early days when, with others, I was founding an online journal, the Journal for Cultural and Religious Theory, which at the time was, very unique, and people question whether they should publish in it or not if they get credit. But I want to ask you a question. It's a little bit, it's related to what you're saying, but a little bit different. So I was able to edit and develop an independent academic press with colleagues, and I had a lot of freedom in developing series and choosing titles. And then I moved to editing a series for a major university press, the Johns Hopkins University Press, I'll just say it. That, I think, was a very different and unpleasant experience, because the pressure there was to get big name authors, bring them into the series. And the decisions that we were making were not on what you're describing, who's innovative, what's experimental, what's new, who's in conversation, all those things that we appreciate as scholars and intellectuals. And it was more about chasing, high profile academics or stars for the series for, as you described, a kind of neoliberal purpose to sell books and to sell the series. So I wonder, in your model, how do we get away from that? How do we get away and make thinking and writing and conversation available more democratically?
Yeah. I mean, and it's a very hard one, because, of course, the way that the press builds a reputation is through its authors, right? And I think it's just gone the wrong direction, like what you described, when a lot of university presses, I think, have also had to change their business models, right? That increasingly they're getting less and less support from the universities. And so they're supposed to break even or even sometimes make a profit for their institutions. And of course, this then kind of, makes it quite important for them that they do get a high enough print run, etc. So I think there's two ways that this could be helped. One, I'm a big fan of having more smaller presses, right? And having a more diversity of presses that maybe operate more within specific scholarly communities. So if you're in a small field, you might have your own press, right? Instead of a university press that's still supposed to, John Hopkins too, it's still quite broad, right? And it's kind of publishing output. Again, this is an ideal situation. I mean, but this is something that I'd like to see, because then it becomes much more of something that is curated by a community. And also, hopefully, these kind of fields can then be more involved in, kind of selecting the more experimental upcoming work. And I do think that this is a really big problem, because as I think I also encountered, I think part of the reason that I didn't get through to any publishers with my proposal was, of course, because it was quite wacky and out there, but mostly also because nobody knew who I was. And I think that is important. It's getting, kind of through that first step. And I think there's something there also for having smaller community-based presses, that mostly people will be known in smaller fields. Even if you're a PhD student, within your field, you will know those people who are doing that kind of research. So there's maybe less of a barrier there. I don't know. So maybe this is a bit of an idealistic kind of, but this is the kind of model that I would like to see, that I think would help solve some of those problems. But ultimately, it's all about money and finances, of course. But if we had the kind of a different publishing model, I guess.
Thank you very much. I think those are great insights. Thank you.
No problem.
And next we have a question from David Blakesley.
Hi, Janneke. I'm Really excited about all the things that you're talking about, and conveniently, you just opened the door for me. I has started a small press in 2002 in the field of rhetoric and composition. It's called Parlor Press. We have a couple of Parlor Press authors in the audience actually today, which is nice to see. David and Barry just sent the full manuscript in this morning. We started as a commercial press in the beginning, partly because of the practicality of developing a nonprofit was a big hurdle. And so we've been a commercial press since the beginning, but in practical terms, we're a nonprofit press, if you know what I mean. Victor commented about the problem with the university presses and series and the kind of name recognition issue. That was actually the reason Parlor Press was launched, because I was a series editor and faced that problem with Southern Illinois University Press. Well, anyway, 350 books later, wow. We're still going. We just had a book long-listed for the National Book Award. Have won a lot of awards, and there's no funding at all. We've published about 70 open access books with no fees required, and they're published right alongside their print editions and given away for free, of course. So it is possible, and it's great to see books like yours and scholars like you come out and show people the way. So I appreciate that. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to throw that out there, and it would be great to talk to you sometime at greater length. Definitely. About how all this works.
I think thank you for doing all the good work for such a long time already. And I think you are the example, right, of how it can be done. So that just sounds amazing. And just to kind of follow on what you quickly said, that you're commercial. I mean, I think what I try to do in Living Books is it's not, we try not to think too much in dichotomies, right? There's a lot of smaller commercial presses that are doing this, that have the same kind of values as the ones that I describe in the book, that just have been trying out different models, right, to try and make books available. So my beef is mostly with the big commercial ones, so no worries about that. If that
well, it amazes me when they publish an open access book in the early days anyway, and it would be 150 links to each page of the book. If you were going to read it, you had to do it that way. That's not exactly open, but yeah, things are coming along a little bit better.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Kevin. Good job with Tech Shop Experiments, and it's great to see those new books coming out. They're awesome.
Thank you so much. So maybe we have time for just one more question before we wrap things up. I don't, unless somebody's hand gets raised in the next moment. David reminds me of something. Tech Shop Experiments is very much a DIY project that was started, with 2 grad students, and we were really lucky to have a bunch of folks that really kind of took a chance on the first issue, and then momentum continually built from there. Since that time, David's become a friend. Victor Taylor has been a part of our unit. I'm looking down the list here. Barry Maurer, of course, David Prescott Steed and Marilyn Allen are both here on the call, and they're both Tech Shop editions authors as well as Tech Shop Experiments. And a lot of this is, coming from just friendships. I mean, or building friendships. I guess friendships built out of these relationships. And I'm, incredibly, and Felix as well is incredibly grateful for these folks and the amount of time and effort that they have given to not just Tech Shop but other projects as well. The last couple of questions and comments were really focused on publishers, and my question might be geared more towards scholars and faculty members. I don't know if I have necessarily a specific question, but again, we kind of started, with this idea of the monograph crisis. And, my day job, at my day job, I encounter many folks who might argue that there is no such crisis. I might personally in the evening hours, refer to them as like flat worlders or flat earthers. Um, but they are publishing monographs and getting promoted and doing incredibly well. I feel like we're all kind of interconnected here with this personal missions of open access and experimentation and the like, and just givingness. I think a lot of what I'm seeing is limited to specific disciplines and specific individuals within disciplines. How do we maybe, I don't want to say convince others that there is such a crisis happening, and how do we welcome others or convince others to kind of join the cause, if you will? How do we essentially, I'm asking you, how do we make friends, but you know what I mean?
How do we make friends and influence people, right? Yeah, no, I think, it is a hard one because, yeah, you're right. I think I'm within media / book studies / digital humanities and cultural studies. And there's been a lot of experimentation there with publishing. And I know there's a lot of adjacent fields where publishing structures are much more, well, conservative, maybe traditional. And it's hard to kind of, within the UK, for example, there's a lot of lobby groups also, mostly historians and traditional English scholars, for example, that still have this idea about the integrity of the book and the printed book and the importance of that. And I think there is a twofold argument made there that on the one hand, open access doesn't change so much for them, right? Not necessarily. And on the other hand, maybe they should change a bit more. So I think it's a twofold tactic of, on the one hand, not scaring people too much. So explaining them like, look, making works openly available or publishing in a different way is not the radical thing. It's not going to mean that your book's going to be pirated and being shredded into remixed bits and all kinds of weirdness. But at the same time, maybe we should think a bit more, also you in your other fields, about what the book is, what it means, what publishing means, what the digital means to you. Because, we're seeing this now. I think, see how everybody has been able to make this shift over to Zoom and even fields, that haven't been doing any digital practices. So we will all have to encounter this in some way. And other fields will have to kind of explore this too. And I'm happy to say that, look, maybe some of the fields that we've just discussed have been forerunners, but hopefully they've created the kind of models that other fields would then be able to adapt more easily, right? And start doing it by themselves. And that's the nice thing of the kind of the scholar-led, the open initiatives that I've been involved in, that they've actually created loads of manuals and loads of kind of, how do I do this? How do I set up a press? How do I start publishing in open access? How do I do experimental publishing? And for example, through the COPIM project, which I am co-PI on, which you mentioned, that's one of the things that we do. We want to enthuse people to start publishing differently, and that this doesn't necessarily have to be art, that the tools and the guidelines and the practices are out there already. So yeah, it's about kind of spreading this wider, I think, and trying to kind of keep telling people that it doesn't have to be that hard. I think that's also part, and we're all doing it, right? So of course it's hard, but it's not that hard, maybe, right?
Everybody in this room is doing it, I think. Yeah. So with that, I'd like to thank our speaker today, Janneke, for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. It was amazing. And thanks, everybody. That was really great questions. And I'm so glad to hear that there's so many other initiatives that I wasn't aware of that have been publishing for such a long time. So yeah, I'm going to look you all up after this. So that's fantastic.
That's fantastic. I will, of course, keep everyone here posted on future Tech Shop Experiments progress and future programs. We have a very big 2022 planned. Definitely be on the lookout for Dan Beachy-Quick's new book, Library of. And in the meantime, thanks everybody for joining us, and be well. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.